or if his conscience smote him as to the way in which he had come by any of his positions, it was the priest, failing the rightful owner, who received compensation or payment or reward. The priests, you see, were in a fair position to grow rich, and yet one cannot discover that they could, as a rule, assert their claims by force. The satisfaction of these claims was left to the conscience of the people themselves. This is what the Romans did, right? They said, right, give us so much, and then give us this, give us that. So basically people had next to nothing because of these high taxes and these demands, etc. The satisfaction of these claims was left to the conscience of the people themselves. It does not seem to have been so left in vain. We hear indeed complaints in the earlier period that the tithes were not regularly brought in, but in proportion as zeal for the law penetrated the Jewish people, as it did, even more and more, punctuality in paying the priests' dues became a prominent part of righteousness. Fear the Lord and glorify the priest, and give him his portion, even as if it is commanded thee, the bread of the trespass offering and the gift of the shoulders, the offerings of righteousness and the holy tumra. We read it in Ecclesiasticus, and it's Ecclesiastes 7:31. In the book of Judith, it is represented as a thing which would call down the vengeance of God, that a mountain village far from Jerusalem, when besieged by a heathen army and reduced to famine, should consume the first fruits of the corn, and the tenths of the wine, and the oil which they had sanctified and reserved for the priests that stand before the face of our God in Jerusalem. Footnote, that's Judith 11:13. You remember how it is a mark of the Pharisees in the Gospels that he gives tithes of all that he possesses, not of corn and wine only, but even of mint, anise, and cumin. The operation of the same law, which so often brought the priesthood under the condemnation of the pious Jews, made its revenues extensive and sure. From all this we may get some notion of the general constitution of the Judean society in that dark period between Nehemiah and the 2nd century. We must think of it as quite a small society. The Jewish people had not the extension which is shown us in the days of Christ. If we had gone in the 5th century BC through Galilee, through all those sacred places so familiar to us, Nazareth, Cana, Bethesda, Capernaum, we should have been among heathens. The name Galilee is the short for Galilee of the Gentiles. That is the region of the Gentiles. They must have gone in there and invaded it and created an authority over it there. The name clung to those uplands between Gennesaret and the sea, even after they had become predominantly Jewish. We should have been not only among heathens, but among barbarians, a population in which the original basis of Syrian peasants, tillers of the soil, had been crossed with the wilder Arab blood which came in by infiltration from the desert. The people of the Jew we should have found only in Jerusalem and in the fields and villages around Jerusalem to a radius of some 10 to 15 miles. The great lines of traffic, the highway along the seaboard between Egypt and northern Syria, the caravan routes between Gaza and the Persian Gulf, left the little hill city on one side. Herodotus, who tells us so much about the East in the 5th century BC, supposedly the father of history, but many theologians and that say, oh, he's a bit of an exaggerator, knew the towns and peoples of the seaboard, but he does not mention the Jews. Let us consider briefly what these peoples were, by whom they were enveloped. To the south, spread over the grassy slopes of the country around Hebron, were the Edomites. That was not, of course, the original country of Edom. Their home had been to the southeast, in the region called by our Bibles Mount Seir. In the last weakness of the old Judean kingdom, they had pressed in upon the southern provinces of the house of David. Ezekiel 35. And had urged on the Babylonian conqueror to annihilate, or totally destroy, wipe out the Jewish state, so that they might occupy its territory themselves. Remember, O Lord, against the children of Edom, the day of Jerusalem, who said, raise it, even to the foundation thereof. In that sense, it probably means like destroy it right down to the very earth. The Edomites again were pushed on the east by a branch of the Arabs, the Nabateans. If it is this to which Malachi points in the passage where we read, Esau I hated, and I made his mountain a desolation, and gave his heritage to the jackals of the wilderness. Footnote indication, Malachi 1:3. We must infer that under the Arab incursions, a part of Mount Seir fell back to waste. But in time, the Nabatean Arabs found the advantage of a more settled life, especially as the caravans which brought the precious gums of the east to Gaza went through this country. And in the last century BC, we find the capital of the Nabatean prince, called by the Greeks Petra, the rock, a gathering place of merchant men, among whom even Roman traders from the far west were frequently to be seen. Strabo 16, page 779. So this capital was called Petra, which supposedly means Peter, before the disciple Peter came along, right? The rock, a gathering place of merchantmen, among whom even Roman traders from the far west were frequently to be seen. The seaboard upon which the Jews looked down toward the west belonged as of old to the Philistines. Israel had never, even in the palmiest days of the Davidic kingdom, secured more than a transient suzerainty over the Philistine cities, and those old cities were still great and flourishing. At least we may say this of Gaza, Ascalon and Ashdod, for Ekron seems to have sunk in relative importance, and Gath to have practically disappeared. The position of the Philistines on a principal line of the world's traffic caused them, no doubt, to eclipse in the eyes of travellers the self-contained community which clustered about the temple of Jehovah on the hills beyond. Farther north the coast was Phoenician, and the Phoenician cities too, Tyre, Sidon, Gebal, Avad, and the rest were still as rich and busy as they had been centuries before. Upon their navies rested the sea power of the Persian king. Their ships still plied between Syria and the farthest west, or the furthest west. They suffered indeed in the provincial rebellions which convulsed the Persian Empire in the 4th century, but fearful as the blow seemed, which fell upon them from the armies of the great king, their hold upon the Mediterranean trade could quickly repair the devastations. They had suffered as much before in the immemorial past. In the interior to the north of the Jews, we should think of the old Syrian country towns and villages still gathering in the harvest and worshipping the ancestral gods in the old way. The immediate neighbours of the Jews to the north were of course the Samaritans, the relics of the old Israelite nation, adulterated by an admixture of other races in those days of national commingling. The relations subsisting between the Jews returned from Babylon, these their brethren according to the flesh, differed according to circumstances. In proportion as the strict legal spirit of Ezra and Nehemiah prevailed at Jerusalem, the two branches of Israel looked at each other with dislike and reprobation. On the other hand, we learn from the book of Nehemiah that the priestly aristocracy at Jerusalem was united by many bonds of friendship and alliance with Samaritan houses. Again, there's lots more information there, so that's quite a bit of information about that first chapter. And he goes on about the Syrians, the Phoenicians and the Philistines. And the different lands and what went on. And it starts talking about the Macedonians and Alexander the Great. It's quite a big chapter, rather large chapter. And then goes on about Palestine and Jerusalem. The trouble of the times reached Jerusalem when Palestine was the gauge of battle. The Jews saw the soldiers of Ptolemy, that'll be Soter, perhaps more than once, march in and again on compulsion withdraw. The city seems on one occasion to have offered resistance, for we are told that Ptolemy took Jerusalem on a Sabbath day. when the Sabbath law prevented effectual defence. So these Jews couldn't stand up and fight back, and dismantled it. After Ptolemy had definitely we'll say, occupied Palestine in 301, a period of comparative peace may be supposed to have ensued, for although the wars between the house of Seleucus and Ptolemy began in the next generation, we do not hear of the Seleucid armies getting further south in this interior than Damascus. But if it was peace, it was subjection to the Ptolemaic government. The phases in the 100 years struggle between Ptolemy and Seleucid make up whatever external history the Jewish state has during that epoch. They are traced in the 11th chapter of the book of Daniel. We have there the break-up of Alexander's empire, its division towards the four winds of heaven, the rise of Seleucus to great dominion, the truce in the struggle about 250 when Antiochus II married the daughter of Ptolemy II, the tragedy in which that truce too soon ended, and the victorious march of the third Ptolemy into the heart of the Seleucid realm, the renewal of the conflict by Seleucus II and his sons. In all these vicissitudes, the Jews were apparently passive spectators. They just stood back and watched. They would often, looking down upon the uplands, upon the Philistine plain, have seen the long lines of King Ptolemy's army moving past the king of the north, covering the country with its tents. The rumours of far-off battles, of the shifting policy of kings, would be a matter of talk in the bazaars of Jerusalem, where they all hung out and probably drank wine and all that sort of stuff, or met, had something to eat. Yeah, probably not so much the same as the bazaars you had in the Middle Ages, or that sort of thing. What they originally were, what they became. Right. That is all that we can safely say. In 223, 100 years after the death of Alexander, he came to the Seleucid throne, the man under whom the controversy was to be finally settled in favour of the northern kingdom, the third Antiochus, commonly known as Antiochus the Great. Antiochus waged two series of campaigns for the possession of Palestine. Already when he began his first series of campaigns, the second, when he first, we've lost it. Already when he began his first series of campaigns, the time seemed favourable, for his contemporary on the Ptolemaic throne was a feeble, voluptuary Ptolemy IV, Philopator. In fact, by the end of 218, Palestine was already in the occupation of Antiochus, but his contempt of his adversary perhaps made him slack, so that when in 217, to the astonishment of the world, Ptolemy Philopator suddenly marched out of Egypt at the head of an army and joined battle with Antiochus on the confines of the desert at Raphia. Antiochus was signally defeated, and all his gains of the preceding campaigns were lost at a blow. The disputed province went back to the house of Ptolemy during the rest of the lifetime of Philopator. When in 205 or 204 Philopator died, and his son, an infant of 4 years, Ptolemy V Epiphanes, came to the throne. So this kid sat on the throne at 4 years old? Wow. Antiochus reopened war. We know next to nothing of the details. He probably would have been manipulated by older people, right, in those courts. But we know that the decisive battle was fought in 198 at the place where the road through the defiles of the Lebanon approaches the sources of the River Jordan, the Battle of the Panium. There was a sanctuary of the god Pan close by, and the place is still called Banias. The Seleucid army was commanded by Antiochus himself and his eldest son. The Ptolemaic army was commanded by a Greek called Scopas. Antiochus was victorious, and Palestine immediately passed finally to the house of Seleucus. The 100 years tenure of Palestine by the Ptolemies comes now to an end. The Seleucid kings are henceforth the kings with whom the Jews have to deal with. It would seem that Jerusalem welcomed this change of masters with delight, and is curious to note in contrast that Gaza remained faithful to the end of the old rule and stood a siege. Ooh, your old belly's getting hungry. Stood a siege by Antiochus, which was one of the famous sieges of the time and made the world talk much of the stubborn fidelity of the Philistine city. No doubt the Jews hated to be under any Gentile power or foreign power, non-Jew power, and they hated the Ptolemaic yoke, especially because it was the yoke which had actually ruled them for the last 100 years. Besides this, it would seem that Scopas had put a garrison in Jerusalem during the late war, and this of course would be felt by the Jews as intolerable outrage. So that when Antiochus, as the book of Daniel puts it, stood in the land of glory with destruction in his hand, he seemed to the Jews as a deliverer. Or perhaps we should say to a great part of the Jews, for there is an obscure verse in Daniel which suggests that the collapse of Ptolemaic rule thrilled some bosoms, chests with a wild hope, and it's in Daniel 11:14. Some people lifted themselves up to establish a vision, and one thinks of a blow for freedom made in reliance on what seemed a prophetic oracle. At all events, any movement of the sort was quelled, was squished, trampled when Antiochus stood at the door. If the royal rescripts given by Josephus is genuine, as Scuda still holds, Antiochus was received at Jerusalem by a festal procession, so they probably held a festival for him, a feast for him, etc., of the citizens amid general goodwill. Get him on their side, right? It's a suck-up sort of thing, right, basically. Okay. And in return conferred large privileges on the temple and the nation. You must take such testimony for what it is worth. But the author thought that it showed at the least that no unpleasant memories were connected in the mind of the Jewish people with their first coming under Seleucid rule. So they basically held this feast, this festival for this Antiochus coming in, right, so they could do their religious practices, their rites, etc., in that land, right? Okay. 2. Hellenism and Hebrew wisdom, and the author gives a reminder that in the first lecture you could see how the little community of Jews gathered about the holy city found itself by a strange turn in the world's history, brought into contact with a hitherto unfamiliar civilization of a very potential kind, the civilization of the Greeks. The seats of the new kingdom, Alexandria and Antioch, were in a closer geographical connection with Jerusalem than Babylon and Ecbatana, and the splendid courts of Ptolemy and Seleucid extended the sphere of their attraction over the neighbouring lands. We shall soon see that this attraction was not unfelt even in the holy city, within sound of the solemn chants which declared the incomparable glory of the God of Israel. But courts were not the chief centres on which the new culture was propagated. There were others, even nearer and far more general in their working, charging the very air men breathed with influences which subtly altered the tempo of their souls almost before they were aware. You remember that Greek culture had been the product of city life. Its association with city life seemed in those days absolutely of its essence. Perhaps under the conditions of those days it was so. At any rate, the Greek could not conceive of his culture except as existing in city-states. And we often find this type of human association, the city, contrasted with the type which seemed natural to barbarians, the village. The Greeks, for the purposes of the higher civilization, were gathered in larger and more complex bodies. The barbarians with lower needs lived scattered over the fields they tilled in small groups of a much poorer sort of vitality. There were, of course, enormous conglomerations of men like Babylon, but these, when Aristotle looked at them, did not seem real cities at all. They had no organic unity, no single life, and were merely multitudes held together by walls and external control. Perhaps this view of things, though broadly true, would require some modification in regard to some parts of the East, of which Syria was one. Here there had been cities before there existed such a people as the Greeks, and when Syria passed under the rule of the Greeks, the ancient cities, as we saw in our first lecture, were there still: Hamath and Damascus, Tyre and Sidon, Ascalon and Gaza, Jericho and Jerusalem. But this is nevertheless true, that while the type of the city had been developed in these lands before it was developed among the Greeks, it had remained stationary at a stage which the Greek cities had transcended. The Syrian city was already a political organism with its own magistrates, kings or shofets or elders, and its own public opinion, which you might have heard expressed where men gathered in the open space about the gates, but it had never expanded to the same richness of life, political and intellectual, to the same complexity of functions, to the same quickness of movement and productive power as the cities of the Hellenes, or the Greeks. Alexander had made it part of his ambition to spread Hellenic culture in the East. He was followed in this by his successors, and you will see from what has just been said that this must necessarily mean the creation of cities. Accordingly, Alexander was a city builder on a magnificent scale. He brought great masses of the drifting Greek soldatesca of the West, for the political troubles of those days had dislodged great numbers of Greeks from their homes, and mercenary bands of soldiers were formed who sold their swords to any employer and promoted the general unrest. Alexander brought masses of these homeless Greeks, as well as of his own Macedonian veterans, and planted them in cities at all the critical points of the world's highways as far as India. Some of the places whose names are rich in association for us English today were once cities peopled by Alexander from the Balkan Peninsula or the Greek states of the Mediterranean. We find the footsteps of Alexander in Merv and Herat and Kandahar. In Syria, Alexander and his successors pursued the same policy, but here at any rate they had not to begin, so to speak, to build from an absolutely new foundation. Here the ground had been prepared for them by the old city system of the land, and their work was not so much the creation of new cities as the conversion of the existing cities to the more developed Hellenic type. Sometimes, no doubt, a new city arose where only an obscure village had existed before, and we do not hear that Antioch itself, the most splendid of all, had any predecessor, unless it were a little mountain fastness on the summit of the hill which backed the royal city of Seleucus. Sometimes an older city changed its name to correspond with its internal transformation. Chaleb became Beroa, and Nisibis Antioch, and the Old Testament Akko became Ptolemais. Even in the cases like these, the original name also lived on and ultimately survived the Greek, as you may see in the Aleppo and Acre of today. And we do not hear of any attempt to impose a new name upon Tyre or Sidon or Gaza or Damascus. What did the conversion of a city to Hellenic type imply? In some cases, no doubt, the entrance of a new element, Greek or Macedonian by blood, into the citizen body. Samaria, for instance, was repeopled by Alexander with Macedonians. In all cases, the forms of public life must have been more or less modified after the Greek pattern. So, where the Greeks were you probably dressed like them, etc., etc. Okay, you basically became a Greek in everything you did. We should have found the citizens' body electing its magistrates annually, and a definite number of the principal men sitting as a senate, which resembled the bulle or gerousia in a Greek state. We should have seen the decrees of senate and people registered upon tables of bronze or stone. More momentous still were the innovations in the social and everyday life of the people. What is it that gives to the lives of men their distinctive character and content? It is what we call their interest, the determination of their thoughts and feelings upon certain objects or pursuits. Change these and the whole life acquires another complexion. Well, it is just in this that we see the chief operation of Hellenism. Suddenly into the old limited life of the Syrian peoples, new springs of interest are introduced. The pulses of men seem to beat quicker under new stimuli. New ideals awaken new passions. Satisfaction is sought and found in directions hitherto untried. The first great interest which filled and informed the life of a Greek youth as he grew to manhood centered in the gymnasium. The gymnasiums were as much of the essence of a Greek state as the political assemblies. They expressed fundamental tendencies of the Greek mind, its craving for harmonious beauty of form, its delight in the body, its unabashed frankness with regard to everything natural. We might say that unsuspiciousness concerning nature, which, if a man is indeed a double being, spirit and flesh at war, hardly corresponds to the maturer view, but which still today marks the Hellenic strain in our civilization. The gymnasiums also served other by ends beside the one of bodily training. They were the social centres in which the life of a Greek youth got those interests which go with companionship, the spirit of common ambitions, and esprit de corps. From the days of Alexander and his successors, we find as a regular institution in Greek cities guilds of young men called epheboi, attached to the gymnasiums and organised under state control. A young man might remain in the ranks of the epheboi for a year. He wore a distinctive uniform, some variety of that Greek country dress, the dress worn for hunting, riding, travelling, which consisted of a broad-brimmed hat, a chalamis brooch about the shoulders, and high-laced boots. But the wealth and pride of the city to which he belonged were told by the material of his garb, or clothing that he wore, by its colour and embroidery. In state possessions, the body of epheboi, wearing sometimes even crowns of gold, form a brilliant cluster in the spectacle. And there's more on that. And every Greek city must henceforth also have a theatre, hollowed, if possible, out of some neighbouring hillside. In the Hellenized cities of Asia, many, no doubt, of the plays watched by the people were poor stuff, inferior imitations of the great Athenian dramatists, to say nothing of such comedies as were frankly vile, but the plays of the great dramatists themselves, of Sophocles and Euripides, at any rate, continue to be acted as Shakespeare continues to be acted today. They did not cease to be a living power in the education of the Greek world. The stadium, the hippodrome, the theatre, these appealed to all classes of citizens, to the general crowd, but in proportion as the mind of any man rose above the lower levels, the more potent and enduring part of Hellenism threw its spell over him. The Greek philosopher, the Greek artist, the Greek man of letters now became figures met with in all the cities of the known world, drawing around them, if not as large a circle as were attracted to the festivals and games, at any rate all those who aspired either from their social position or their mental endowments to a higher culture, and indirectly moulding society through its leaders. Greek culture, Greek literature were thrown open to the peoples of Near Asia, and they pressed into its pale. They had native literatures, but these in the new daylight looked poor and unformed. Now those who wrote must write Greek. Those who thought must think on the lines of Greek science and philosophy. So the result is that today we know more or less about many thinkers, to all intents and purposes Greek philosophers, who were natives of the old cities of the Phoenicians and Philistines. We have the 130 Greek love poems of the Syrian Meleager, the witty Greek writings of the Syrian Lucian, but the old books which their fathers had read and copied in the old tongues of the land when Isaiah and Jeremiah were writing at Jerusalem had perished forever without leaving a memory. Of course, Greek culture could not spread apart from the Greek language, so that Greek became the language of the educated all over the eastern Mediterranean lands. It would be generally understood in Damascus, Tyre and Ascalon after they had taken on the form of Greek cities. In the country villages of Syria, native dialects, Aramaic or Canaanite, were perhaps the only language known. Even in cities, such dialects lived on as languages of everyday life alongside of Greek. So this Aramaic, etc., didn't turn into Greek, right? They lived alongside it, these people that spoke it in the languages. And we find Tyre and Sidon putting Punic legions, as well as Greek, upon their coins. But the native languages could not compare in prestige or popularity with Greek. For the higher purposes, Greek was used almost exclusively. If we had looked round about us, there would have been a great deal in the Syrian cities of those days to show us the predominance of the new power. We have spoken of the gymnasium as an institution, well as a building. The gymnasium would have shown us the familiar forms of classical architecture. The new political organisation would require new buildings, a hall for the Senate and such like, and the new social life would create the indispensable stoas, cool pillared galleries for lounging or lying around, and these couches and all that sort of stuff. And all these would be Greek in form, so relaxing, so you'd probably have baths as well. Dress too would be then as now inseparable as an outward symbol from the particular form of civilization. And if today our hideous European clothes tend to displace the beautiful old garments among the richer classes in Japan or India, simply because a prestige belongs to our hard black hats and drab cylindrical coverings as a token of the ruling civilization, how much more would, when the ruling civilization had a worthy garb, would it be felt a dignity to wear it? We should have seen the epheboi of Tyre or Ascalon with their broad-brimmed Greek hat and fluttering chalamas, and the richer men and women not easy to distinguish by their appearance from their contemporaries in Ephesus or Athens. When that power we call fashion sets in a particular direction, you know how it breaks down all conventions, how it masters the younger generations. The author wanted to dwell on this subject, because you are so often told in popular books that the East never changes, that Orientals have an invincible repugnance to Western ideas and so forth, and scripture pictures are supposed to show their fidelity to fact in proportion as they were copied from what you see in Palestine today. Well, you would make a great mistake if you imagined, say, that Damascus of St. Paul's time was like the Damascus of today. In St. Paul's time we should have found ourselves in a Greek city. Arabs from the desert in native dress would no doubt have appeared in the streets, and Jews with their fringes and phylacteries, but we should have seen the citizens of the upper class to all appearance Greek. We should continually have heard Greek talked around us, and the environment would be largely made up of Greek temples and halls and colonnades. Hitherto, the author has spoken, or speaks of Greek civilization, of Hellenism, as if it were all one thing. He has spoken of it as a superior, the more vital civilization, in contrast to the old life of Syria. But one must guard oneself against a misunderstanding. The qualities of Hellenism had their necessary defects, and under certain circumstances, Hellenism could take on forms which were very far from lovely. Its political vitality, for instance, even in its best days, was continually running into partisan vendettas. And the history of the Greek states does not want its list of atrocities, or take such an institution as the gymnasium, which we are considering just now. In its ideal, there is an obvious beauty. The body, developed to its highest perfection of harmony, agility, and strength, is an end good in itself. The training involved a high degree of asceticism, and there is something of moral nobility in the figure of the athlete, as the old sculptors loved to fashion it. Lucian makes some point to the primitive statues, tight-strung, sinewy, hard, clean outline. A footnote below here has this in Greek from Lucian's Rhetor, Precept 9. Lucian makes someone point to the primitive statues, tight-strung, sinewy, hard, clean in outline, to prove the necessity of painful effort, abstinence from sleep and wine, and spare living. St. Paul goes to the gymnasium for a simile to present the Christian life. So he's trying to make a comparison by the looks of it. He that striveth for the mastery is temperate in all things. Well, that was the ideal, but there were other things often connected with the gymnasium. So what's Paul saying there? Someone that spends a lot of time trying to gain mastery of his body, all this sort of stuff. It's just temporary, right? All that's temporary. There's greater things than that, like, submitting yourself to God and all this sort of stuff. Exercise is good, but physical exercise is good, but spiritual is more beneficial. That's basically what he was trying to say in accordance to the scriptures. Well, that was the ideal, but there was other things often connected with the gymnasium in actual practice, as every student of the classics know, which are of very evil savour. Even apart from these, the cult of the athlete grew to such proportions in the Hellenic world that already Euripides could speak of it as a public nuisance. It is, after all, the accomplishment to be most honoured and rewarded in a citizen. He makes one of his characters ask that he should be an expert wrestler, or a good runner, or able to throw a discus, or strike an opponent's jaw in handsome style. It's down here. What's his name again? Euripides, fragment 284. You can see how easily it might come about under certain conditions that the abuses of the gymnasium should be more prominent than its ideal nobleness. And so it is with the other constituents of Hellenism. Its ideal was a real power. Its ideal made its attraction for nobler minds, but its actual embodiment might show all degrees of degradation. Now we have reason to believe that it was just in Syria that Hellenism took a baser form. The ascetic element which saved its liberty from rankness tended here more than anywhere else to be forgotten. The games, the shows, the abandonment of a life which ran riot in the gratification of the senses, grosser or more refined, these made up too much of the Hellenism which changed the face of Syria in the last centuries before Christ. The people of these cities, a historian wrote, about 100 years before Christ, are relieved by the fertility of their soil from a labourer's struggle for existence. Life is a continuous series of social festivities. Their gymnasiums they use as baths, where they anoint themselves with costly oils and myrrhs. In the Grammatea, such is the name they give the public eating halls, they practically live, filling themselves there for the better part of the day with rich foods and wine. Much that they cannot eat they carry away home. They feast to the prevailing music of strings. The cities are filled with end to end with the noises of harps playing. Very unlikely that picture is overcoloured. You must remember that the man who wrote it, Posidonius, a man of huge literary industry and a philosopher of the noble school, was himself a Syrian Greek. But it cannot be altogether untrue. But it is time to turn our thoughts to Jerusalem. You can realise now something of what it meant for the Jewish community, this change of their environment by an agent so far-reaching as Hellenism. This is quite a different ordeal from any to which they had been subjected under the old unprogressive Oriental dynasties. The strange transforming influence which won so easy a victory over the native traditions of other Syrian peoples, Aramaeans, Phoenicians, Philistines, reached to Jerusalem also. But at Jerusalem, this influence, powerful and subtle as it was, encountered an antagonistic which could bring from a world outside the domain of Hellenism a unique power of resistance. You know, some modern writers like Matthew Arnold are fond of representing our own culture today as involving in itself the great antithesis of Hellenism and Hebraism. Well, here for the first time in history, Hellenism and Hebraism meet. The little community on the Judean hills, which maintained something of an eccentric indifference to the movements of the time, which seemed entrenched in a mass of mysterious observances, Sabbaths, and rules of food, began to attract the curiosity of Greek inquirers. The first reference we have in Greek to the Jews comes from writers of the 3rd century BC, in the early days of Macedonian rule. They speak of them as a race of philosophers, that is to say, the nearest analogies to the Jewish community they could find were philosophic brotherhoods, like the Pythagorean, or orders of men like the Indian Brahmins, who also had their peculiar rules of cleanliness and diet. One theory was that they were actually a colony of Brahmins to start with. Another theory was that they were of Egyptian origin. The resistance offered by the Jews to Hellenism attracted notice by its contrast to the readiness with which the Orientals generally adopted the new way of life. But the degree of resistance was relative only. Even here there were large sections of the nation who in some degree succumbed. Who took to this new way of life, right? In recent times, or they took to the Greek way of life. In recent times, says a Greek observer of the first half of the 3rd century, under the foreign rule of the Persians and then of the Macedonians, by whom the Persian Empire was overthrown, intercourse with other races has led to many of the traditional Jewish ordinances losing their hold. And it has down the bottom here footnote. Hecataeus of Abdera, quoted by Diodorus, is it like 40 or something like that? Verse 3. Ooh. Yeah. Looks like it. Note 3. And if it is true that even under the Persians, influences from outside had been felt in Jerusalem, how much more must it be so now? Think, for instance, of the attractions to commerce. In days when the commerce of the world had received an extraordinary stimulus, when such a great mercantile centre as Alexandria had been created a few days' journey from Jerusalem, it could not be but that the Jew should begin to drift into the new cities in order to trade, and if he still adhered to the piety of coming to Jerusalem for the great feasts, he brought back with him the atmosphere of another world. There was at this time no diaspora, no dispersed multitude of Jews, such as existed 2 centuries later, but already probably in the 3rd century BC, the number of Jews resident in Egypt was considerable. It must have been so if, as is thought, the translation of the law into Greek, the nucleus of Septuagint, goes back to this time, for that of course implies a large body of Jews who have come to use Greek as their natural tongue. And just in proportion as the Egyptian Jews kept up their connection with the Holy City, would they be intermediaries between the Hellenic world and their own people?